Welcome to Coach on Call with your host, Cheryl Richardson.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is Cheryl Richardson. I'm live today, and I'm really glad about that. I'm looking forward to hearing from you and talking with you and also sharing a special guest with you. It's Monday. As we all know, you're listening to Coach on Call, and I'm going to give you the number to call because if you'd like to speak with us, my guest is going to be with me for the whole hour. If you'd like to speak with us, it's always good to call in early so that you get in the queue. Otherwise, you may not get a spot. The number is 866-254-1579. That's 866-254-1579. For those of you who would like to call in from outside of the U.S. or Canada, dial the country code and then 760-918-4300. That's 760-918-4300. And today we're talking about growth, inner growth, like we often do. I mean, we talk about a lot of different things on this show, but today we're going to focus on how we need to grow in order to live an authentic life, a life that's rich and deep and meaningful. And I'm very excited to have our special guest today, Jim Manganiello, who is a dear friend of mine and also a very talented clinical psychologist and author of a book called Unshakable Certainty. And Jim is going to be spending the hour with me because for a long time, I've been doing the show for 10 years now. And for those of you who listen pretty regularly, you know that I'm a huge fan of good therapy. I've talked over and over again about the importance of doing the inner work, the inner healing work that we need to do in order to show up in the world truthfully and with courage and in a way that really reflects who we are, not who the world wants us to be or who we think we need to be, but who we really are. And so Jim is a therapist. He's a really bright man, very wise. And, there's a handful of people in my life that I really enjoy getting together with and having deep conversations. And Jim is one of them. I do it every chance I get. So the last time we were together having dinner, I thought, you know what? I want to share him with you. I want to be able to have some conversations. And so the show today, I really want to focus on, I'm going to call it advanced conversations about growth because, I've learned as a teacher that when you kind of, we'll see where we go with it. But what I want to try and do is raise the bar in terms of the conversation that we're going to have today and really look at some of the common conditions and obstacles that prevent us from just living truthfully. And so as you listen to Jim and I talk and as you listen to the show, then you can determine what it is you'd like to call and speak about, because what you're thinking you may need help with right now may actually be different than what you discover in just a short amount of time here. So let me begin by welcoming Jim. Hey, Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. It's great to be here.
I'm glad to have you here with me. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I've posted your website, Jim, for those of you listening either now or during the archive, right on my Facebook page, you'll see a link to Jim's website and to his book, Unshakable Certainty. Jim, I know you've been a therapist for a long time, right? Over 30 years, I think it is.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah. And as I was thinking about the show today and thinking about our conversation, I intentionally didn't plan anything. I didn't plan, the typical interview. Well, tell me about yourself and tell me about your book, because I know we'll get to that. But I guess I just wanted to start out by saying, you've been working with people for a long, long time, and people from all walks of life, I assume. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And so if you had to just say a little bit about some of the common challenges you see people being faced with who come in to work with you, what might some of them be? I'll just leave it at that and we'll go from there. What are some of the common challenges?
There's a broad range of kind of dilemmas and problems that people come into therapy with, and if we could put them in a pot and boil them up, we could probably reduce them down to two primary dilemmas that people have that are very, very significant and that cause a great deal of pain and suffering. And The first is emotional confusion. And the second are mistaken assumptions about the nature of what's real, mistaken assumptions about the nature of reality. And maybe we'll take the second one first. We're all incredibly conditioned. We wind up coming into this experience of life helpless at a level where, and I think you and I have chatted about this a little bit. I've got an evolutionary biologist friend in Australia, and we were chatting on Skype one day, and we agreed almost simultaneously that if women could give birth to 14-year-olds, we'd have a much greater chance to survive as a species, let alone be able to enjoy ourselves. And the dilemma is that we really do show up before our time. And we're highly dependent, and our minds are just tremendously undeveloped. We simply don't have the mind power to make sense of the circumstances we're in, or to do the kind of due diligence on the ideas that the people have that we grew up with, or that to check in on whether their sense of who we are is based on a clear sense of attunement to us, or whether they're projecting all over us. Mm-hmm. And sad but true, as kids, we develop an image of ourselves, often referred to as a self-image. And this image begins to have great authority. Again, we don't have the mind power to say, well, I love Mom, but she can't see straight on Tuesdays. Or I love Dad, but he's maybe drinking too much at dinner time. Mm-hmm. And we just don't have the ability to filter out, and we develop a view of ourselves based on other people's view of us. Mm-hmm. And this really sticks. It's like if you've seen that, I think it's called Gorilla Glue.
Yes, yeah.
This ridiculously powerful glue, and it gets stuck on us as a sense of self, as an experience of who we are, as an I or a me. And that sets up all kinds of problems. Fundamentally, it is an experience of identity that has no real foundation. In fact, so that we're always scrambling trying to make it work. And we expend so much energy, and we go through so much pain and suffering, and then we enter into a culture. Few people understand today that although we are the most advanced technological culture to have ever lived, or at least we, unless some of the assumptions about thousands of years ago might be correct, but, we can't demonstrate or prove that. So we've got a highly technological society, but we've got perhaps one of the most naive and unaware psychological cultures that's ever existed, because we've downloaded such nonsense. Paul Simon had this line, I believe in one of his songs, I learned so much crap in high school that I nearly lost my mind. And, it just gets laid on thicker and thicker and thicker, and then we wind up getting depressed, and we wind up getting anxious, or feeling lonely, or not knowing really how to be in relationships, and we blame ourselves for this. Mm-hmm. And in truth, it's more a reflection of the dilemma of the times that we live in and the circumstances that we live in.
So people show up
there just to make sure I'm making sense to you. And
yeah, you're making complete sense. So
good.
So then what I hear you saying is then people show up in therapy and they think it's about, the breakup with the boyfriend, or they think it's about, the fact that the boss doesn't treat them the same way that he treats the other employee. But the reality is that so many of us as adults, we enter into adulthood with an idea of who we are based on, other unhealed people who raised us. So we're always in reaction. We're never really connected to who we are authentically. And so it almost sounds like, we spend the first half of our lives taking in all of this erroneous information. And then if you're lucky enough to get into therapy or to do the kind of healing work that's necessary, you can start to dismantle a lot of that and discover what's underneath.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Exactly. And, it's tough for folks because most, in the past 100 or so years, science has colonized psychotherapy, and science's marriage with commerce has made things even worse. So now there's a whole reality that's been defined based on a rather limited view of what psychotherapy is. If you look at the word psychology, it originally meant logos of the soul. That is, it was a pursuit of self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the pursuit of self-knowledge in pursuit of the greatest opportunity of a lifetime, which is to become who we truly are.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's been completely lost, largely anyway, in mainstream psychology and mainstream psychotherapy, and a lot of therapists will train, and they'll go to all kinds of efforts in terms of schooling and education, and they can even create a career that seems fertile and alive, and they'll never even touch who they really are, understand that that's really the bottom line aim and purpose and goal. So that to become who we truly are, therapy doesn't become just an opportunity to figure out what happened in our family. And if we weren't raised by at least half-awake people, of course we've been banged up. That's
Mm-hmm.
a given.
Mm-hmm.
We're under the obligation, of course, to map that. In other words, what forces are at play in my psychology that leave me being reactive in certain ways that might limit my ability to make sense of my life or to become all that I would like to become. And most importantly, again, the target is to become who we truly are.
When I hear you say this, Jim, what it makes me realize is, so in particular when you talk about therapists, who become well-trained and they go to school and they build a practice or a career or whatever, without having necessarily done the work themselves. I mean, I think about all of the people who influence us, whether it's a therapist or a doctor or a teacher or I'm talking about professionals, let's say, a nutritionist, a meditation teacher, a yoga teacher, whatever. When I think about the people who influence us, self-help authors, right? Self-help teachers,
Right.
It kind of makes me scared because I think, well, if these people aren't doing their own inner healing work, right? If they're not consciously and intentionally pursuing their own self-knowledge, right? Becoming, if they're not connected to the desire to uncover who they really are and express that in the world, then they're just doing the same thing to us that was already done early. In other words, they're just contributing to the problem.
Right.
Right?
Right. There's no question.
Yeah.
And, if you add that again to what happens, if you look at our educational system, many colleges of liberal arts have changed their names because now it's much more marketable. It's so important now, since colleges have understood marketing a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
They're making a ton of money, and they like to change the name from College of Liberal Arts to College of Arts and Sciences.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember teaching, actually, when a group of science professors, very well-intentioned in terms of what they thought reality was, they lobbied hard to get rid of a music and art course that was spellbinding in order to add another science course.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think of the influences in our culture, we're all somewhat aware that the great religions originally were inspired by a revelation of significant truth and beauty and meaning, but that revelation, in order to be understood, demanded that we be in a certain state of mind. We could kind of refer to this as a state-dependent revelation. And that what winds up happening is that all of these folks begin to gather around this revelation, but they can't access the state of mind that originally sourced it, so they dumb it down into a kind of ego preoccupation, and the same kind of madness goes on again and again and again where we have some organized doctrine and dogma, and people wind up thinking that, Jesus said, follow me, as in believe in me, make sure you do this and do that, instead of do what I did. But most people don't recognize that science is one of the most potent religious movements that's ever existed. It's significantly brainwashed the largest number of people that I think have ever been impacted and folded into a system of belief that's interfered with their own well-being. For example.
Good. I was going to say, give us an example.
Yeah, the hardcore scientific position, the tough-minded scientific position. And by the way, scientists are great, and some of the most spiritual people are certainly counted among some of the more talented, creative scientists. But the dogmatic position, the position that's influenced the minds of most people, including those who claim to be religious, is that materiality is all that exists. That the material world is what's real. That if you can't see it, touch it, feel it, taste it, it ain't there. That it represents some kind of an earlier atavistic notion, superstition, ghost in the machine, and what it does is it builds its altars on the ordinary mind, the conceptual mind, the mind that is constantly thinking in associative thought, and it misses the deeper possibilities of knowing, which hover around our deep intuitive mind, what I would refer to as our deeper mind, which doesn't necessarily operate in accord with linear logical thought, but is much more tuned into flashes of intuitive insight that can be life-changing, that deliver packages of knowledge and elevations in our sense of what reality is. So as long as we're thinking that material reality is real, we make all kinds of, is the only reality, we're quite limited in our sensibilities. For example, most people wake up thinking that General Electric turned the sun on so they could drive to work. We're far away from the direct experience of there's a huge ball of fire in the sky. To encounter that directly is to get a taste of the mystery that is the much greater reality behind this experience that we're going through.
And, when you say that, Jim, it also makes me think, most people, it's so easy for us to be preoccupied with the daily challenges of living, the nuisances or the real difficulties that we're faced with. And so I guess in a lot of ways, the reasons people stay asleep or continuously go back to sleep is because, after a while, it just becomes mind-numbing to try and manage such a chaotic life. A life that's so technologically driven now, right? Because, most people can't go to the bathroom without having their cell phone with them, right?
Yeah, I think you're correct. I think it's a huge problem.
Yeah, because because when you're talking, it always comforts me when somebody says, look, it's the examined life that leads us to the depth and the meaning and the certainty, which you write about. And I want to talk about your book, the certainty that you talk about. It's slowing down and stopping and going inside and doing what we need to do to examine our own lives and to start to peel off the layers of stuff that have been, plastered on us by people and systems and, all of that over for our life thus far. And most people are so caught up with just trying to get through the day that it makes it easy to not take on that journey. I'm curious, how has your approach to therapy and working with clients changed over the years? Or how do you approach working with someone today, and how might that be different than even, 5 years ago, let's say?
The wash on the canvas, the answer to your question is that, of course, when I was originally trained, I was very excited or even educated, and a combination of educated and trained to be exposed to these ideas that felt so compelling and that were so fascinating and interesting. And I became very skilled at being conversant with them. But the real work, the discovery that I felt like I really had this work in my DNA was when I became deeply committed to doing it myself.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I did it myself, the more I was able to digest and metabolize some of the things that I learned in a way that it really departed from the original form that I was exposed to, because they became wired into who I am.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like becoming an instrument of what you know, not only cognitively and conceptually, but experientially.
Mm-hmm.
So that's made a significant difference, because I don't necessarily abide by, I paid the price not to have to be limited by the narrow, small-minded ideas that tend to keep people trapped in therapy relationships that don't really lead anywhere, or that might be entertaining and consoling, but don't necessarily get on with the business of becoming who we really are. I mean, this is, look.
Well, and how that reflects in life, because I'll tell you, I get so many people who will call this show and will say to me, oh, yeah, I've been in therapy, and either they're not in therapy with the right person, or they don't feel like there's any forward movement in their life. So then they label something wrong with therapy instead of that relationship. So,
Right.
Yeah, you're saying that, you want, you're not just interested in like getting together and shooting the breeze. You want people to actually begin to embody what they're learning so that it's clearly reflected in their daily life.
Totally. And your example is a good one, and it's not unlike being interested in having good pizza. And you can go to 3 or 4 places and not feel that it's great pizza, and what's all the hullabaloo about pizza, and conclude that pizza sucks, when in truth you just haven't been in the right place, right place for you to have the kind of pizza that you were hoping to have.
Right.
So that my sense is the inside of every person is a tremendous amount of wisdom, and that it's up to the therapist to position that person to connect to it and to stabilize that connection and to strengthen it so that they can begin to experience it unequivocally. That is, not to have doubt about it. They can begin to be instructed by it. They can begin to be led and directed by it. And that is the surefire path to become more of who we truly are. And
okay, I love what you just said. That it's a therapist's job to help the client to stabilize the connection to their self, like with capital S.
correct.
And really, that's what your book is about, right? The process that you write about is really about creating and stabilizing that connection. And of course, I think that's what everybody wants. Everybody, regardless of what the situation is in someone's life, I'd say everybody who calls this show is essentially saying, help me to connect with the wisdom that they say exists inside of me. Help me to create some kind of a channel I can rely on and then live by. So can you say a little bit about how you help clients to create and stabilize that connection?
Yeah, of course. Again, the basic foundation is to create a relationship where the chemistry is right and there's some deep sense of rapport, and not to have a script, not to see another person's life as if somehow they are now going to do what the script says they should do, but that there needs to be some partnership between a therapist and a client or a patient in order to discover that script together. For example, some folks come in depressed.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there are some experiences of depression that reflect organic brain problems, but they're in a tremendous minority. The vast majority of depression represents a kind of a symbol with understandings that are begging to come about how that person is living their life. If you're in a room and you turn the temperature up to 90 in the thermostat and you start to sweat and get hot, you're not going to think there's something wrong with you. You're just going to need to make the adjustments on the temperature in the room. Mm-hmm. Similarly, depression, even anxiety, sometimes it's just a remarkable finger pointing at what we need to know about ourselves and what we need to do to change the situation. Now, sad but true, many people would rather have medication than to have to do the work they need to do to dismantle this inaccurate identity. The self-image I referred to earlier, the travesty is that whether our self-image is accurate or not, we think, feel, and behave in relation to it.
Right.
So in some ways, we're caught, we're stuck, we're trapped in an identity that's too small for who we are. There's this whole therapy notion that, well, what you've got to do is peel the onions back. Well, actually, you have to get rid of the onion peeler. That's the task. We're the problem, but we have to do so with generosity and friendship toward ourselves. We can't do it in a heroic, self-hating way or in a sportive way, in an egoic way. We have to do it with a tender heart and realize that we have a dilemma here. We don't know really where we are, what we're doing, or who we are. Sometimes we get a feel that there's something very, very deep within us. And inevitably on the horizon, particularly at midlife, we know that death is no longer hidden by the curvature of the earth. We're going to die. Mm-hmm. And that can be terrifying, particularly if we bought in and downloaded the scientific view of the world, the hardcore view, which is, look, we know everything. The scientific method has taught us everything. And that is that when we die, our body is dead, our brain does not continue, we die. Any intimation that something is different, that's so narrow-minded. If you wake up long enough, you can discover two very frightening but also liberating things. One, no one's in control here. No one. Mm-hmm. Two, nobody has any idea what the hell is going on. Mm-hmm. There's something happening here that is profoundly greater than what gets represented in our daily life, particularly through the media.
Right.
Which is just a chronic river flowing of hype, horror, and nonsense. Mm-hmm. But always reinforcing the notion that the world is the way everybody tends to think it is. It's okay not to know what's going on. Mm-hmm. It's our preoccupation is what? We want to look pretty. We want to make money. We want to be correct. We want to be right. One of the biggest questions that has come up in the last 10, 15 years is, how do we monetize the Internet?
Right.
It's not how do we feed the 18,000 children that die every day when there's enough food to feed them. Mm-hmm. It's not really to take care of the planet. It's just, not to beat this a negativity drum, but it's just absurd the way people are suffering, population, the water's being destroyed. I read an article the other day that 50% of the surface soil on the planet has been compromised because of marketing schemes that don't take into consideration the need to protect the earth, mm-hmm. but rather just next quarter's profit. So clearly something is awry, and as you pointed out, I think so wisely, everybody's so whacked, stressed, mm-hmm. And we don't have enough space even to think, wait a minute, this is nuts. We don't need to be living this way.
Well, and I agree with you. And there are days, I'm sure you've, I can't say I'm sure you've had this experience, but I think you have because I know you. But, there are days where, and I know a lot of people who listen to me feel this way too, where you just want to lay down and cry at the insanity of it all. And as you talk about, what we're doing to the earth and the ramifications of the way life is right now, it's just pretty clear. It goes right back to our original conversation, which is if you have people who aren't doing the work of exploring who they are and creating that connection to a deeper wisdom and stabilizing the connection and then using it, then this is what you get on a macrocosmic level is, you get a world's kind of spinning out of control. And, there are some days, there are some days where I think, Jesus, well, there are some days I think, God, is it too late? I don't like to think that way, but I do. On the other hand, I think something you said is really important. It's ironic that so many of us spend our lifetimes, especially the first half of life, not thinking, trying to avoid death, right? Avoiding the reality that we're not going to be here. We just kind of live in this sort of fantasy world that life just goes on and on, this childlike fantasy world that life goes on. And then midlife comes. And the gift of that is, just like you said, you realize, oh, wait a second, there is an end here. And the ironic thing I've found is that the more I face that reality, that we are out of control, just like you said, and that life as we know it consciously will end, the more liberated I feel. And I'm wondering, because you said that yourself, that it's both the scariest thought and the most liberating thought. How do you make that connection? How is that liberating for people?
Well, again, I think we do have incredible wisdom within us, and I regard that kind of as something that we can source if we know how, and that's the dilemma, isn't it? So if we say that this I or me that we tend to operate from, that is part of a self-image that was basically developed through millions of interpersonal appraisals with people outside of us, with others, not with direct contact with ourselves, then we realize we've got a real bind here, which is that we're trapped in an identity that's not quite who we are. Now, if I say the greatest privilege of a lifetime is to become who we really are, some people say, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
Who else am I going to wake up as if it's not who I really am? I'm not talking about it as some kind of a thing where, your mom took the wrong baby, or they gave the nurse gave the wrong, or you need to change your identity. And I'm talking about a fundamental fact, truth, rather. Truth tends to be a little more meaty and a little more emotional, that we've kind of lost track of. And I think in the 13th century, frankly, they had better grasp of it, that there's something very deep within us. We can intuit it. We can't connect to it often strongly enough to develop confidence in it, but we can get a sense that it's there. We can fall in love and touch it. We can take very powerful psychedelic drugs and touch it. We can be moved, if our imagination is active, we can be moved by a work of art that was created by an artist who had an experience, profound experience of sacred heat, whose imagination then transformed that experience into an image. If we know how to see an image instead of just look at it, we can get a taste of this in an intuitive lightning flash. So in therapy, we often talk of the metaphor of alchemy. Alchemy was not, I learned in high school science that the alchemists were these idiots that ran around trying to yell at lead to become gold. And when alchemy is really a metaphor for deep inner work. And there's many different ways of characterizing it, but for the context of what you and I are talking about, and all of your listeners hopefully also immersed in the conversation, we can talk about three stages. The first is often referred to as the Nigredo, Nigredo, and it's there are some images that tend to be associated with one of them is a woman tethered to a potbelly stove whose face is blackened with soot. And the Nigredo stage of inner work and the Nigredo stage of depth psychotherapy, of deep inner work, is that we have to learn to come in contact with everything we don't want to know about ourselves. And we we lose half the population right there. Because it takes more courage to do that than it does to play, linebacker for a professional football team without a helmet on. But actually, the courage comes from inspiration, because you can pick up the fragrance that your freedom depends on. And that on the other end of that experience is the possibility of an experience of the truly brighter colors in life. So a therapist and a client or patient work together as a team in this Negredo, where you begin to develop the observational power to track the forces at play in your psyche, particularly those that are wounded, particularly those that are mocked up. And they're usually of two kinds. One, from actual experiences that we've had in our family that have left us marked up, either intolerance, emotional abuse, simply not having been seen, not having been respected, having been tormented by siblings. Families can be pretty strange places to grow up in if people lack a critical mass of awareness. So once we do this, we begin to develop what I like to think of as matador skills. So when our stuff triggers, instead of getting gored by the bull, so to speak, we give it the cape. And that is the second stage of deep inner work, deep psychotherapy, which is referred to as the albedo, which is a whitening phase. That is, I see my scars, I see my wounds, I see my sensitivities, I see the flaws in my self-image that might wake me up in the middle of the night convinced that I'm dumb, stupid, and ugly. And I realize that these are just fictions that are pouring down on me through discursive thought, which is discursive thought is great to figure out what day it is, what time it is, even to reflect on one's life nobly. But it carries tremendous risk because it drives us into storylines that can become like waking dreams, and we become protagonists in the same waking dream almost daily, in which we're trying to avoid what we don't want to know about ourselves. I want to pause just for a moment and do a U-turn back to the Negredo. And these are not always just one after the other linear phases.
Right.
Stages. We can go back in them. As we begin to map the forces at play in our psyche, we begin to almost spontaneously develop more acreage, so to speak, of awareness. We develop a greater capacity for awareness, a greater capacity for, everybody is kind of on the mindfulness bandwagon, even though most people don't know what the hell it is. We can develop in this inner work capacity for heartfulness, particularly toward ourselves. And then if we do enough of the infrastructure renovation in our personality, if we can dismantle the hole that this conditioned self-image has, then lo and behold, this third stage is referred to as the rubedo. And these names are not what's important. It's the process that's what's important, where all of a sudden we almost don't have to do anything, but it's who we truly are begins to surface quite naturally. And we can have a kind of reunion with our own soul and be a very profound experience that changes the direction of our life forever. So we still are attached to our family, but we don't necessarily belong to them. And we're no longer burdened by being locked into the script of what we learned while we were being raised in that family.
So the first step really is about just identifying our own wounds, and then as we become aware of those wounds, we start to see ourselves more objectively and how we operate in the world, and when we're being influenced by those wounds, and we can make a different choice. And then eventually we begin to, like you said, the real us emerges, and we have more freedom to operate from that place instead of the conditioned reactive responses. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would add to that, we not only discover our own personal stuff or baggage or wounds or what I call briar patches. Let me give you an example of a briar patch for those of us that are married. Marriage is for the most part, a 24/7 compulsory relationship, the only one other than our family of origin.
Mm-hmm.
And as a consequence, the unfinished business in our family of origin can surface in our marriage rather nicely. Two people trying to be married without benefit of a reasonable map are like people trying to fly an F-15 that's been dropped off in their driveway. It's impossible.
I love that. That's great. It's so true. As someone who's been married a long time, it's very true.
Yeah,
it's like having children, right? It's just like having children too. It is like having an F-15 dropped off in your driveway, and now
absolutely.
Here you're supposed to pilot this thing.
And people are misled by the culture that we're supposed to know how to do this.
Right.
In any event, for example, if I was raised by a mother who guilt-tripped me, let's say at a level 8 on a 10-point scale,
mm-hmm.
and I'm using this as an illustration of the dilemma that we're in, and make reference earlier to the two primordial dilemmas that human beings have. One, emotional confusion, the other, mistaken conceptions about the nature of reality. So if I have got a lot of scar tissue around this, and a few of us realize how reactive we are, how trapped we are in the same damn repetitive movies. And let's imagine that I'm married to somebody who has once in a while she guilt trips me at a level 3
mm-hmm.
on a 10-point scale. Because I have scar tissue in my emotional memory around being moved around by somebody trying to guilt trip me, I can experience a flow of emotion from those wounds in the past that will make me register what I'm going through with my wife in present time at an 8.
Mm-hmm.
And I can act accordingly and
mm-hmm.
fire what heat-seeking missiles are in my weaponry basket. And it's not only in our marriages, though. It's in our work.
Right.
It's in our daily life. We tend to be very, very reactive, particularly if we haven't mapped the forces that, have an awful lot of influence in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you talk about this, I think it's a miracle that we survive the way that we do on the planet, given the fact that most people don't do this kind of work. And would you say, Jim, that in order to do this kind of, to engage in this healing journey, do you need to work with a therapist? I can't imagine doing it without somebody else in some...
I think, Cheryl, first of all, to your point, and I'm actually, and you know this, I'm collaborating with just a fantastic abstract artist, one of the world's foremost abstract artists, Frank Arnold, and we're obviously coming from markedly different places, but we both resort to the imagination in our work. It's a tremendously potent tool for self-knowledge, and I think art is a path. I also think that certain kinds of therapy are just tremendous assets on the way. I think that properly used, very carefully used, psychedelics can be a very potent tool.
Mm-hmm.
Improperly used, it's a terribly bad idea, because taking psychedelics, particularly strong psychedelics, is like dancing with a hurricane. And I'm not advertising it. I'm not lobbying for it. I'm just trying to be truthful. One of the things that psychedelic experiences offer is that they blow you into your deep identity. Sometimes not very comfortably on the way, but you can have an experience. And so experiencing it, you see straight. And what you can do this in therapy through the process that we've talked about. And sometimes the thing is that, recent research indicates that, first of all great art is either in museums, galleries, or rich people's homes. And most people have no idea what the hell great art is. They think it's pretty things. Or art has become a commodity now. There are clearinghouses for great art. Sotheby's took in, I think it was $688 million in a month. All these paintings are being... And the travesty is, again, nobody taught us how to use our imagination as kids, in part because the church banned all images in 800, except the Trinity. And people mistake their imagination for the imaginary, and the imagination is a faculty. It's like an organ in one's deeper mind. It has to be activated, and everything changes when it is. But so one of the things that I'm experiencing is this is potentially a very exciting time. I do believe the bad news is I don't think this species is going to continue to survive unless a critical mass of people become much more conscious and we do a tugboat turn towards something of deep values. Not, if you I don't know what your life is like, but when I hear this crap going on in American politics, I'm convinced that the least among us are trying to steer this boat.
Yeah, I know.
And they lack anything that we could remotely call wisdom. I don't even think they have a letter W on them.
We could do a whole other show just on that conversation. That's for sure. That's for sure.
This, I believe that knowledge itself, that wisdom itself, is going through a transformation. It's separating from the old forms. It doesn't want to just exclusively be tied to even great, great, great traditions, like, for example, Sufism, Tibetan Buddhism, esoteric Christianity. They've all had their day. The knowledge is profound. It'll bring you to your knees and make you weep, but the form doesn't work for Westerners in 2015, which is why there's been so much crap going on in these meditation centers and so much, scandal, yada, yada, yada. I think there's a new day coming, and there's going to be collaboration between art, deep psychotherapy, other things that can bring forth a more meaningful and even I would go as far to say a more sacred appreciation for what life truly is.
Yeah, I want to ask you this. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to, and I appreciate this conversation, and I want to capture it all, which is why I've not taken any calls, because this is the kind of conversation that those of you listening ought to listen to over and over again, because there's a lot here. Can we just talk for a little bit about this art as a tool for healing? You talked about, therapy as a path, psychedelic drugs, and art. Tell me what you mean by that. Are you talking about making art? Are you talking about seeing art?
Well, I'm talking again about dismantling our identification with this surface identity, basically located in what I would refer to as our ordinary surface mind, our surface personality, our persona, Cheryl, Richardson, Jim Manganiello. They're characters we have to live with, and when they're excessive, when their stance is excessive, we have trouble dropping into our deeper depths. And I'm talking about our conditioning. I'm talking about, obviously, and I think when we move toward our deeper mind, there's a tremendous, not only wisdom within us, but we have access to levels of reality, levels of consciousness that can bring us to our knees with respect to what they have to offer us. And the imagination is not only a bridge to that, but it's actually part of our deeper mind. So if we can activate that, that will go a long way in our being able to appreciate the value of images. So I can look at an image now, if I'm in the right state of mind, and I can find the experience the artist had when creating it.
Mm-hmm.
And if the artist herself or himself has done some deep diving in their own consciousness, it very much represents a kind of profound experience of truth. Now, the same levels of truth are sometimes embedded in spiritual traditions, but I don't know that they're easily unpacked today in the form that they exist in.
Right.
I've been a meditator for more than 35 years, deeply immersed in contemplative practice. Part of this is included in my therapy work, but I'll be the first to tell you that it's harder to find more crazy people than people that have given themselves up to spirituality with their egos.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So are you saying, Jim, then that looking at a piece of art that was created with a higher level of consciousness can give us an experience, it can connect us to a deeper part of ourselves in that moment?
If we can see.
If we can
this
see.
This is part of the development, the collaboration that I'm doing with artists, particularly with the artists that I referred to,
Mm-hmm.
is that if all you have is your fleshy eyes and your ordinary mind,
mm-hmm.
you're not going to have a chance to see this image.
Mm-hmm.
Because your associative mind's going to say, I like it, I don't like it, I don't know what the hell it is, or it reminds me of Matisse, or it reminds me of my cousin Freddie. And you're not going to have the space to drop into a direct experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a story that is significant, which is that in the old indigenous tribes in South Africa, when a woman wanted to get pregnant, one of the things she did was she went to the ocean and she wanted to have a direct experience of the soul of the child that she was going to conceive. And she would go to the ocean and she would wait for an image that could embody the child's essence to occur to her.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes this would take a good period of time, and moving the image here and there. And in order for her to see that image, to feel it, she had to be aware and awake.
Right.
Not in an ordinary consciousness, which is always focused on outcome. Oh, where's the image? Where's the image? But a real receptivity to a life that was coming to her.
Mm-hmm.
Once she got the image, she would go home and show it to the prospective father of the child until the father himself could see the image very, very clearly and could unpack it and get a feel for the essence of the child. And they would make love, both of them, with the image in mind, strongly in mind. And when the woman conceived, they painted the image of the child's soul on the front of her body. And they would often, it was painted facing inward so the child's mind's eye could see it. There's a difference between the fleshy eyes and the imaginal eyes. The imaginal eyes. So once the child was born, of course, they had this image all around her.
Right.
And they gave this image for her to be with in very peaceful states of mind, the three of them. So when this child needed to find her deep core, when she needed to find...
Oh, Jim, hold that thought. We're just at the end of the show. I just want to say to everybody, please go to Jim's website, drjimmanganiello.com, and check out his book, Unshakable Certainty, so that you can continue to hear a lot of his wisdom. Jim, thank you so much for being here on the show. Sorry we've got to end. Thank you, everyone, for listening.